presenting barriers to repair, but also opportunities for repair. So this panel focuses on kind of the role of widespread computerization of everything, from toothbrushes to agricultural equipment, and the particular role that plays in the right to repair. So I'll turn it over to Perzanowski.
Great, thanks. Everybody, good morning. Good to see you all again. So my name is Perzanowski. I'm a professor at the University of Michigan Law School, where I teach and write about, the intersection intellectual property and personal property. I've been writing about repair and tethered devices and what ownership means in the digital economy for about, 15 years now. I am joined a wonderful group of panelists this morning to talk about this question of the role of computerization in repair. I've got a few kind of introductory remarks, but before you hear from me, let me introduce the panelists. First, we're going to hear from Paul Roberts. Paul's the editor-in-chief of the Security Ledger. He's the founder of Secure Repairs and the Secure Resilient Future Foundation, and my personal go-to resource for any question dealing with issues of security and repair. Next, we've got Lachlan Urquhart, who's a senior lecturer at the University of Edinburgh, co-director of the Scottish Research Centre for Intellectual Property and Technology Law, and the founder of something called the Regulation and Design Lab, which sounds absolutely fascinating from what I've read about it. And then finally, we'll hear from Denver Gingerich. Denver is the first director of compliance for the Software Freedom Conservancy, the organization that, in addition to supporting lots of free and open source software programs, is responsible for defending and enforcing the GPL. So great group of folks to hear from. I want to set the stage a little bit here and offer just a little bit of historical context. So, manufacturers have been pursuing various forms of planned obsolescence for, at least a century, right? We can date this back to, at the very least, the Phoebus cartel in the 1920s, the group of light bulb manufacturers who got together and decided these products last too long. Why don't we shave a few hundred hours off of their operating lifespan? By the 1950s, in the kind of post-World War II economy, and this is detailed in this remarkable book from, I think, the early 1960s called The Wastemakers by Vance Packard. If you've not read this book, it's absolutely worth checking out. By the 1950s, manufacturers had adopted a wide range of kind of anti-repair strategies, some of which mirror the strategies that we continue to see today, right? So things like products that can't be repaired without completely destroying their outer casing, products that require hours of disassembly to swap out a 15-cent part, refusal to make service and repair manuals available, right? This was all going on in the 1950s. Those tactics, a lot of them are still part of the playbook today, but something else happened in the 1950s that kind of changed the game in a pretty important way moving forward. In 1956, 3 physicists from Bell Labs won the Nobel Prize for inventing the transistor, right? And that kind of, sparked the sort of computerization that we're going to be talking about for the rest of the panel this morning, right? It's transformed not only our technology, but our economies and our societies in both wonderful and terrible ways, right? So today, as we all know, right, computers and the software that they run are ubiquitous. They are inescapable. They're in our pockets. They're in our kitchens. They're in our garages. They might be in our bodies. And so software, I think, is really changed our relationship to these products in at least kind of 2 ways, right? First, software provides manufacturers with a kind of granular degree of control that was really sort of unheard of prior to the introduction of software, right? It's not only granular, it's reliable, it is persistent, and it's a form of control that really changes that dynamic, right? So you don't have to wait for a part to fail anymore. You can code failure into the device from day one, or you can push an over-the-air software update that is going to remove functionality or make repair more difficult long after you've bought the thing, taken it home, and made it part of your life. Beyond that shift in sort of product design and engineering, there's a second way that computerization really changes things. And that's the fact that the legal system has really embraced these sorts of restrictive software licenses. And that also contributes to the kind of weakening of consumer control. So the kind of legal fiction that embedded software code is licensed to you but not sold to you gives manufacturers a degree of new legal control layered on top of their control over engineering decisions. Okay, that I hope is a useful background to kind of set up the set of questions that our panelists are going to address, right? So things like, what happens to our connected devices, when manufacturers lose interest in continuing to support them? What are the implications of those kinds of decisions for security, for privacy, for longevity? How do we encourage firms to design products in a way that take these kinds of concerns seriously? And how do we make sure that the inner workings of the products that we all rely on remain sort of legible and observable to us? I think each of our panelists are going to have some important things to say about those questions. So with that, I'll turn things over to Paul.
Thanks very much. Excellent introduction, and actually you kind of give a lot of background context in which about the things I'm going to talk about. My name is Paul Robertson. I'm the president and founder of Secure Resilient Future Foundation, SURF, and we are a 501c4 nonprofit that is focused on really cyber resilience. So promoting smart policies to encourage cybersecurity, resilience, and so on. I'll talk a little bit about kind of how that came to be. My background is really as a cybersecurity journalist, which I've been doing for the past 25 years, 24 years, and an industry analyst. And it's kind of like the Matrix when you're writing about something for a couple of decades and covering it and talking to experts. You sort of start to see the pattern, right? And I got involved in the right to repair movement back in 2017, after I met Nathan and talked about, I was writing a lot about Internet of Things and security, and talked to Nathan about this whole repair issue and learned that cybersecurity is a really effective means for manufacturers to kill proposed right to repair. All I need to say is if you make service manuals and schematic diagrams and diagnostic software available, you're opening the door to hackers. And I kind of knew that that was not the case, and was able to sort of organize a cybersecurity community to advocate on behalf of right to repair policies. So kind of understanding the problem that we have right now, as again, talking about the matrix and kind of seeing the pattern. I think one of the core patterns is we as a society, and it was Canada, the US, less so the EU, but we have had cyber policies over the last 40 years, let's say, or software policies. We have enacted some, but they've been few and far between. And this is kind of a timeline with both Canada and the US that shows the bulk of software related policies we have are kind of 80s, 90s, early 2000s. You know, necessary, effective for their time. The Computer Security Act was inspired by war games, I think. You know, the movie, you know, things like HIPAA absolutely address problems that came up, and so on. But what they don't do, what they haven't done, is to adapt with the evolution of technology itself and the advancements we've seen in technology. And, you know, that is becoming a bigger and bigger problem. What we have now is a kind of transformed technology ecosystem from when many of these laws were enacted. 29 billion IoT devices projected by the end of this decade, you know, around 50, you know, probably 17, 18 billion right now. And these products, software-driven products, smart products, are really not in the concept of the laws that were passed 20 or 30 years ago, right? The idea that, you know, as Aaron was saying, manufacturers can just, you know, shut down or alter a product that you bought kind of with a software update. And the cybersecurity impacts of that are also substantial. So we are seeing these days just continuous attacks by cyber criminal groups, nation state actors against what are called edge devices, but many of these are smart home devices or like broadband routers that are either unpatched or unpatchable. So support has been, you know, ended by the manufacturer. They can't get software updates anymore. They're being taken over by malicious actors and used to further other attacks against critical infrastructure, companies, hospitals, you name it. Huge public health and safety implications for these attacks. We probably haven't seen the full dimensions of them, and we don't really want to, but we may. This is all because manufacturers are, in essence, allowed to, as I like to say, privatize profit and socialize the cyber risk of their products. Use smart features to collect subscription revenue, to you know, sell really cool, fun features, and sell products based on those, but then walk away from them and make the public, their customers and the public at large, pay the costs of security failures and things like that. And so that is why, you know, one of the reasons I started SURF, to try and address some of these problems. An example of this, Chromebooks, right? I don't know if it was the case in Canada, but in the United States, definitely during the pandemic, many school districts purchased Chromebooks because they had students who were suddenly doing remote education, millions and millions of them. And Chromebooks are just kind of low cost, but, you know, functional devices. And then, yeah, so 48 million. And what ended up happening was, in a few years after these districts bought all these Chromebooks, the support for the Chrome OS was ending because Google had, like, I don't know, a 5-year support life cycle. Many of these devices, when they were bought, had already been sitting on the shelf for 2 years, right? So they, in effect, only had 3 years of support. There was a huge effort, including by PERG, to force Google to not make these school districts buy new Chromebooks at a cost of hundreds of millions, billions of dollars. And Google, being Google, acceded to that, agreed to extend the support for the software lifecycle for up to 10 years. But this is a sort of microcosm, or not even microcosm, macrocosm of this problem of, you know, buying equipment that then just kind of dies. Now, the reality is, from a cybersecurity perspective, many school districts may not have gotten rid of their Chromebooks because Google ended support, although they probably would have had to, because many of the, you know, features that they use would have broken because of that. But other Other businesses, other homes, support ends, software security updates end. What do? Well, if the device keeps working, your home router, right? You just keep using it. And the security consequences kind of fall to us as a society of that. This is data from a company called Gray Noise, just kind of giving you, and I'm sorry I don't have any Canadian provinces here. Their research is focused in the US. But this is Gray Noise has technology that kind of identifies vulnerable edge devices, and they do a report called State of the Edge. And this shows what are called residential proxy botnets. Botnets are malicious networks. Residential proxies are internet-connected devices deployed in residences, small businesses or homes. It shows a botnet growing from 2,000 to 300,000 endpoints in a period of 72 days, and 73% of it is this graphic on the left, are home networks. Okay. And then these maps on the right show a map of compromised malicious endpoint devices, edge devices in states, and those numbers show you how many there are. California has more than 500,000. Texas, 167,000. New York, 200,000. Massachusetts, where I live, 34,000. These are deployed in communities, on public school networks, and so on. And they're fodder for malicious actors. So what do we need? What we need are some new policies that address these types of risks to society and to consumer rights. And that's what my group is advocating for. So we've introduced legislation already in 3 states in the US, New York, Massachusetts, and California. And I have the bill numbers there, that specifically talk about this end of life issue by saying for device makers, if you're selling a product to consumers, you need to tell them before they purchase it how long you're going to support the software for. If you're a company that leases hardware to consumers or businesses, if that hardware goes out of support, is no longer supportable, patchable, you need to replace that at no cost to your customer, right? So that's what those bills do. And that's just the beginning, honestly. We need a portfolio, we need a tool belt of different rules and regulations to start to manage the reality that we're living in of the Internet of Things, smart connected devices. I think device makers should have clear off-ramp, for smart products, so that when they're proposing to build a new smart product, they understand when we're walking away from this product, ending support, here's how that's going to play out, so that the needs of the public, our consumers, and society are addressed. And that's kind of the graceful exit concept. So that's kind of what I'm working on, and working with folks like Nathan and Kyle and Aaron and Denver. And there's a lot of work to be done, a lot of work. Thank you.
So, hi everybody. Thank you to Annalisa for having me over here. Paul, it was a great overview of some of the issues in this area. So I'm Lachlan Urquhart. I'm a senior lecturer in technology law and human-computer interaction over the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. As has been mentioned, I lead a research group called the Regulation and Design Lab there, and also various other things. And what I'm going to talk about today is a project that I led for 2.5 years, a range of disciplinary projects with a range of different university partners, and a lot of people. So it was a very exploratory project funded by the UK Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council, where we had a law and ethics sort of strand, we had design research, we had human-computer interaction, and a lot of the project was trying to understand and problematize some of the issues around consumer Internet of Things, longevity, repairability, and a sort of equitability component as well, as to, this assumption that if things break, we're just going to be able to somehow replace them. So that was kind of a big driving force in some of the work. And we were trying to sort of synthesize these perspectives across a legal component, but also with the kind of design aspect, as how would we improve and envision better ways of designing these things. So repair, not necessarily just being returning to original functionality, but almost having this more normative dimension as to how could we challenge some of these current infrastructures and ways of doing things within this project. So there was a lot going on. It was a really fun project, a lot of exploratory bits involved. So I'm going to talk about a couple of them this morning. So my research more generally, technology law, I kind of work a lot around data protection, cybersecurity regulation, a lot of AI regulation in recent years, but always at this kind of interface between how do we design and how do we regulate, and how do we do things like security by design, privacy by design, and the likes. And so this problem space in particular, a lot of things that have been mentioned, we were kind of motivated by this challenge that IoT, there's this bundling of smartness, or if you call it smartness, into a lot of consumer technologies that allows them this ongoing control, where the products are more of a service, the issues that a lot of us in the room are also very familiar with. But we kind of wanted to take a slightly broader view as well in terms of how we were framing the right to repair. So some of the folks in the project were coming more looking at hardware repair and repair cafes. But there was also some of us that were interested in the sort of software dimensions and to a degree the AI side as well. So trying to look and see, what are all these different routes to redundancy that can be the reason as to why these devices are no longer being supported. So that then involved looking at a lot of different bits of regulation that have been coming out in Europe and UK. So some of the things that Paul had mentioned, sort of like the EU Cyber Resilience Act, already tries to mandate things like minimum periods of support for how long once devices are on the market and they will be supported for, and trying to make this clear to consumers at point of sale, and trying to mandate that security is something that has to be done across the life cycle, and putting in place mechanisms for your software updates for 10 years and all these kinds of things. But then older frameworks like the GDPR, which is the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe, which is in 2016. There's things in there again around putting in place technical and organizational measures for security by design, data protection by design and defaults, but also a lot of really interesting rights that data subjects whose data is implicated by these devices have in terms of rights to erasure of their data, rights to data portability if they maybe want to get the data from the service and move it to another one, things like that. So trying to figure out how that might support a right to repair. And then some of the things that were mentioned yesterday, I'll talk around like the eco-design framework, where there's very specific guidance in some of those bits of legislation or in sort of phones and tablets, where you have to design it so the battery has X number of deep discharges, or the screen can kind of have a certain number of scratch, resistance to scratches, or all that kind of stuff. So very building that in as legal requirements. This has to be mandated. And then more recently, just a couple of years ago now, the Right to Repair Directive, and how that has tried to deal with, listening to yesterday, some of the issues that have been talked about in terms of trying to force manufacturers to kind of repair goods even outside of sort of formal warranty and liability periods, and trying to make sure that this is done for a reasonable price, to not make it prohibitive for them, or if that can't be done, to provide replacement goods, or even like back order of spare parts, not putting them to be like 6-12 months out so that people will go, well, I can't wait that long. Putting in place mechanisms to try and cascade this down the supply chain. So with a lot of these IoT devices, it's quite tricky to figure out who actually is responsible. So yeah, figuring out if it's goes to the distributor or the importer, if not the manufacturer. And some really interesting things, I guess, around designing for repairability and what that means in terms of improving ease of disassembly. I mean, I thought the example yesterday was fascinating about the adhesive being kind of removed by electrical charge, and yeah, so that kind of stuff. We're thinking more ahead as to how can we make more modular, repairable things, and a range of other stuff really. I mean, even the European Online Repair Platform that kind of provides this ability to search and have access to a range of repairers, and things like requiring member states to try and promote repair, so trying to put in place financial incentives for repair cafes, things like that. So there's a lot of really interesting stuff in that bit of legislation that's trying to shape norms, trying to sort of shape the design side and also the market in general. So one of the things we did in the project was there's a lot of different bits of law here. It's quite complex. It's quite hard to kind of parse what it means in terms of design. And I've done a lot of bits of work in the past around ideation decks, which are very popular in sort of user interface design, HCI research. So we decided to make a deck to try and take some of these different bits of legislation, translate them into a physical tool, which I've got with me if anyone wants to really look at. And again, trying to map across these different domains of regulation. And we did this and we sort of tested it in a range of workshops with product designers, product design students, and there's a lot of different elements to it, which I won't have time to go into in much detail, but there was different ways in which I think one of the key aspects of the cards was we tried to sort of think about the different stages of the life cycle and where these regulations become relevant at different stages in the life cycle. You know, so some of them were anticipatory, designing for repairability is something you would have to do at the design stage, but then during use, some of these spare parts requirements are clearly things that will be much more relevant whilst the product's out in the world. And the end of life, some of these, you know, data portability rights or right to erasure rights are much more relevant at the end of life for products. So trying to sort of scaffold in that these regulations do lots of different things, but they're relevant to different stages of the life cycle of these products. So we would kind of get people in the workshops to take an example scenario of a particular IoT technology, how it might break or how it might not have support anymore from the manufacturer, and work through how would some of these different legal requirements shape how you would design this or how you would deal with that situation, looking at the main risks, what sort of safeguards you're going to, what you would want to implement, and some of the challenges you might face in doing that. So that was quite a useful exercise, just to kind of have those discussions. Another bit of work that we did in the project was we did a bunch of workshops around different parts of Scotland, where we were trying to get a bit of a sense of some of the challenges that people were facing in different regions. So parts of Scotland are more rural, parts of Scotland, obviously, the central belt's a bit more urban, and just having these discussions with members of the public about why, you know, we wanted to kind of get some of the stories. Why do people care? Why would someone want to get stuff repaired in the first place? It's great that the law is trying to push this, but trying to get a bit more of the human stories as to why people are motivated. So that was a really rewarding part of the project where, you know, we would get a sense of why do people value these things in the first place? What challenges have they been facing? And I guess a lot of the discussions that we're having yesterday in the panels and so forth, they were very much replicated there. One of the methods was we kind of, like my colleague Louis Suarez, who's running these with me, had these sunny and cloudy walks where we get people to reflect on when they've had a particularly positive experience or a more negative experience in trying to get something fixed. And this was one of the anecdotes from the data, which I thought encapsulated a lot of the challenges that we've been talking about over yesterday and will be today. So it was this one, my Fitbit was recalled, except it wasn't, just told to stop using it, the battery was at risk. So I was given a voucher, asked for its value, I got it second hand, so I was quids in, I was making money anyway. There was pressure from them to buy new, but I was allowed to get another second-hand one, and then I just used the vouchers at Amazon. I still have an item in the drawer that's no use to anyone. I've seen them on sale on eBay, which could be dangerous, and I plan to take it to the recycling centre. So just like it's quite a rich, there's so many of the problems encapsulated in that very short interaction of someone reflecting on the problems they faced and trying to deal with this IoT device. So they've got a lot of data with these kinds of narratives and these stories, which we're currently kind of working through and looking to publish. So that's just a bit of an overview. Okay, well, thank you very much.
So thanks for having me here. I'm Denver Gingerich. I work at the nonprofit Software Freedom Conservancy, and today I want to talk a little bit about box theory, which I think will be helpful for us to fix our technology going forward. So first, I wanted to start with a history of observability of technology, because when we have observability, we then have repair, as long as we have tools and some know-how along with that. And with repair, we get personal technological autonomy, which I think is key and why we're here today to talk about this. So for a long time, observability was inherent in our technology. So for example, you might have a nail or a horseshoe or something like that, and you could see if it was bent or if it was chipped or something else like that. And so this was generally easy to repair. You could either do it yourself or with the help of a local blacksmith or someone else like that. And so this was a wonderful thing that we had for many millennia. But then we had the Industrial Revolution and things changed a lot. And we didn't have the means of production anymore. At least most people did not. I would say that when we don't have the means of production, it is essential that we have the means of repair. And I think we did indeed continue to have this for some devices for some time anyway. One example I want to use today is cars, trucks, and tractors. So for most of the 20th century anyway, these were fairly repairable devices. And one of the main reasons for that is we had some assistance with observability. And this was in the form of shop manuals and similar sorts of documentation that we had for these. These were things that manufacturers would provide, often just because it was the thing that people demanded. So this is a shop manual from Ford Motor Company of Canada for Ford and Meteor branded automobiles. And so this allows us to maintain observability even in the face of more complex technology. So this has been very important to have for these more complex devices over time. Now, some things changed then in the later part of the 20th century and into the 21st century, and that is that we had software. And now software is not inherently different from other sorts of technologies. It does change some of the aspects of observability, but we already saw with the Industrial Revolution that when you change observability, there are ways to ensure that it is retained. However, what did not happen when we shifted to a lot of things in software is this retention of observability. And that is because companies stopped giving us the shop manuals. That is, they did not give us the source code for the software that is in our devices. And that is why things have changed a lot with software, not because there's anything inherently different, but because we don't have the shop manuals anymore. And so I think it's really important that we continue to have source code for our software. That's a big thing that Software Freedom Conservancy works on, and that a lot of developers are intentional about doing. But companies do continue to lock things down. So, for example, the software that you get today from Google or Apple or Amazon or Microsoft or Ford or John Deere is by and large provided without source code. So we cannot make the changes that we've been able to make with our technology in the past. So to help us discuss this and talk about this a bit more, I wanted to introduce box theory. So I'll just read this out. Box theory says that there should be no limitations on how you can modify, change, adapt, repair, or fix a device that is in your possession. And so that is to say, within that box's four walls, whether that box is shaped like a phone, whether it's shaped like a car, or whether it's shaped like a television or any other device, you decide how it operates. So this applies to both the hardware and the software. So you should be able to change any of the hardware that is inside of it to either modify it or replace components. But importantly, it also applies to the software. So we've heard that software we often have tethered to the different manufacturers' servers when they sell it to you. And this is a big issue and something that we should be able to change. We should be able to tether these devices to the server of our choice, maybe our own server, or a server run by a nonprofit that we trust, or we should be able to turn it off entirely. And so I've noticed a couple examples of this. over the past couple of weeks. One of them is a company called Bamboo Lab, which makes 3D printers. And we've noticed that they have software that is tethered to Bamboo Lab, but they don't let you change the tether. And they do this despite building on software that intentionally gives you the rights to be able to do that. So they're violating the software agreement that they agreed to when they started building on this software. And so we at Software Freedom Conservancy are working on this along with Kevin as well of Hulu. And we're making sure that these companies do give you the source code when they are required to do so. Another example that was announced on Wednesday is that the Ontario government is now saying that the Ontario police cannot use camera drones from China. And the reason for this seems to be that they're concerned about what China might be able to see when they're using these drones. And I would say that this is not an issue with them being from China. This is an issue with us not being able to change the tether on these devices. And so I think that's what we are really after. We want to be able to control these devices for our own purposes, for the legitimate purposes of our governments. And it's very important that we have a framework to be able to discuss this. So I wanted to just briefly mention a couple of points about box theory that we can discuss a bit more if we like later today or otherwise. One of them is this issue of possession. So I was very intentional about making sure that box theory talked about possession of devices rather than ownership, since companies seem to say that you don't own the things that you buy, you lease them or license them or some other word they might use. And so I think it's important that we be able to control devices that we have physically in our possession, but we could find other words for that. Another thing that has come up often over the convention so far is liability. We've had this discussion over the past century and a bit already. And despite cars being very heavy, traveling at very high speed, and being extremely dangerous, we decided we should be able to repair them still. And so I think it's not too much of a stretch to say that we should be able to repair devices that are much lighter, slower, and safer to use. So I think this has been solved, but I'm happy to discuss liability concerns with this sort of an abstraction as well. Now, lastly, I wanted to say that box theory is intended to be used in a few different ways, and I would encourage it to be used in these ways. One of them is talking with friends and family. As an example, I was talking with a relative about subscription seat heaters in cars, and he said, that this is wrong. And I said, yeah, well, why? Why is it wrong? Why do you think that? And he said, I don't know. It's just inherently wrong and viscerally wrong. And of course, I agree, absolutely. But we didn't really have a framework for discussing this. And so that's one of the things I would like to use box theory for, is to be able to say, this is why it's wrong, because we do not have the rights that box theory says we should have. And the other way that I wanted to encourage this to be used is when we're considering legislation or similar things, we should use box theory as a litmus test. Does the legislation help us with box theory? Does it hinder that? Does it make it easier for companies to lock things down? Does it have those effects? So I think that's another important aspect of this as well. So I wanted to end things by noting here that you can find these slides at that URL above. The slide source code is available, as you might expect from a talk by me. Also, I did just want to mention a couple things coming up from Software Freedom Conservancy. One is a software right to repair lawsuit that we've been involved in for almost 5 years. There's a trial coming up August 10th. This is happening in Orange County, California. We are suing Vizio because they're not providing the source code for their televisions. that they are required to provide because of the software they've chosen to use. They're now owned by Walmart, so a fairly formidable opponent, but we are confident in our case. The last thing I wanted to note is that we have our annual conference coming up at the University of British Columbia starting August 6th. We do have a right to repair track that is co-organized by Kyle Wiens and myself. So I would encourage you to submit your talk to that. The CFP is open for another week if you would like to do that. Please do submit to that if you would like. We would also be happy to receive sponsorships for a repair cafe if you're interested in doing that at FOSSE this year. So thank you very much. Thanks for having me here.
So that was a great set of talks. I have a handful of questions to ask our panelists, but I'm also eager to hear from all of you as well. So I don't know, there are a few places that we could start here, but one thing I'm curious to hear from each of you is there seem to be a lot of misconceptions, right, that crop up in this space, whether that has to do with questions of security, questions about liability, questions about product design. So I guess the first question is, what do you think is the most important misconception that you've encountered in this work, either dealing with policymakers, dealing with firms that are producing and selling products, or members of the general public when it comes to their relationship with their devices? Please.
I would say one of the biggest misconceptions, and I think this applies generally to everyone, policymakers, consumers, and it is kind of exploited by manufacturers and product manufacturers, is this security through, there's security in obscurity. That by keeping our code and the workings of our product in a black box so that only we have access to it, we are keeping out malicious actors and hackers. That makes it secure, which appeals, I think, to our kind of core sense of like, well, if you lock a door, that's securing your house. But practically, as Denver explained, there is no security in obscurity. Keeping the workings of your software secret does not prevent the Chinese or Russians from figuring out, what vulnerabilities there are and how to exploit them. It does not, lessen or reduce the risks of that software. In fact, it increases it because it prevents the lack of transparency, allows vendors to pursue, other objectives and not invest in security. So I'd say security in obscurity is probably the biggest misconception out there. And consumers have it, as well as policymakers. They just buy into it very instinctively, and it's a problem that you need to kind of disabuse them of that notion.
Sorry, did you go first? So I suppose, taking my perspective from researching in this area, the projects and things like that, I suppose there's an element of, as the talk kind of showed, there's a lot of legislation, there's a lot of law that's been emerging in this area, there's quite a patchwork of different areas. But I suppose within legal research, the misconception might be that that's enough. I think kind of taking this more interdisciplinary approach to how we understand the right to repair, which is obviously, I think, conversations over today have very much shown that it's not something you can take a very siloed perspective of, that this is just a design problem, this is just an economic problem, this is just a competition problem, this is just a legal policy problem. So I think that dimension of trying to, when you're researching this stuff, break down this kind of framing it within one discipline as this is how we're going to solve it and understand it, but trying to kind of challenge that. I think that's what some of the motivations of the project were very much trying to do, because have these conversations across disciplines that wouldn't necessarily have come together, but try and see if there's exciting new ways of thinking about how we address some of those issues.
in research. So yeah, to me that might be one of the misconceptions from more academic communities is that this is the solution, this is the way forward. But actually, you do need to have that slightly more holistic perspective, particularly in this area, because there's so many contact points that we need to work out how do we, and yeah, it's great, the CRA's got these guidelines about, the Cyber Resilience Act's got these guidelines about life cycle secure by design, but how do you implement that? What does that actually mean for the designer, the people who are developing these technologies to realise that and to comply for sure and enforce that compliance, but equally, how do we understand what different sets of practices and techniques and approaches will they need to develop to be able to actually instantiate that and make that reality? So I think those sorts of questions you have to have as disciplinary guidance.
Yeah, so I would say one of the things that you alluded to earlier is that I think a lot of people think that when the manufacturer stops supporting a device, that the device is now useless. And I think Chromebooks were an interesting example. The vast majority of Chromebooks have a write protect screw, so you can disassemble the Chromebook and you can unscrew this little bit, and that allows you to flash whatever you want to onto the Chromebook. And then you can run Debian or a variety of other operating systems on it for as long as Debian supports them. Debian generally supports old hardware for 25 years or more. They still support the Pentium 4, for example. So this is a great way to put more life into those devices. And it's not just computers, it's things like phones as well. So with Lineage OS, you can run a device with full security patches for up to 8 years. With OpenWRT, which is a Software Freedom Conservancy member project, you can have a router running for 16 years or more with fully updated software. And I think the reason for this is because of the incentive model. So manufacturers don't have any particular incentive to make your device secure, except for liability and reasons of the image of the company. And so if they don't think they're going to be liable or otherwise, they're just not going to support it. Whereas people who run projects like OpenWRT or Debian, they use it themselves and they want to keep their software secure as long as possible, and they want to share that with other people. And so I think that's something that's kind of underutilized, these options that we have for keeping our devices secure for much, much longer than manufacturers care to keep them secure for. And I think we should use those options more.
Wonderful, thank you. Thank you all for those responses. So a couple follow-ups then, Paul. Paul, you talked a little bit about the kind of end-of-life legislative work that you're doing. Could you just give us a little bit more detail about kind of what the basic approach is in that statutory framework, and also, how has it been received? What's the process been like in terms of making its way through state legislatures?
Yeah, thanks. So as we heard, this is kind of just scratching at what the Cyber Resilience Act in the EU has already, accomplished in a much more robust way. The idea, and in some ways the idea behind Secure Resilient Future Foundation was based on my work with repair.org and seeing that going at the state level and getting states to enact progressive legislation, it's a lot easier than trying to get the US Congress to do it. And so what we said is, states have, consumer laws. Let's turn to those and try and get some of these needed changes enacted. And if we can get enough states to do that, that will increase pressure on maybe the federal lawmakers to respond, which we're kind of seeing with the right to repair, though, not much to show for it, but maybe. So the idea was basically, it's narrowly focused, and it's really around consumer information, almost like packaging, which is just making software support part of the disclosures that you need to make to customers when they're purchasing something. Because right now it's just completely not transparent as to how long the software will be supported for, even though that software support may really impact the functioning of the device. If it doesn't just ending support, shutting down your cloud servers could kill some large percentage of features, or it could kill the device entirely, as we're seeing, right, with the Kindles and so on. So just being transparent about that and allowing really market forces to have an impact. So customers looking at smart refrigerators might say, okay, well, you know, the Samsung cost an extra $100, but they're supporting the software for an extra 7 or 8 years, so that's going to figure in my decision about what to buy. The only other thing it does is on the addressing some of the risks that my slides on the compromised devices put out, which is a huge percentage of those little dots you saw on the maps of California and New York and Massachusetts are on ISP networks. Many of those are devices owned and distributed by the ISPs themselves, but compromised because maybe the software is no longer supported. So holding vendors like that accountable for the infrastructure that they are managing and selling and profiting from. So that's kind of the concept. It's a very small beginning. It's a first step on what I hope is a much longer path to implement the types of rules and regulations that we're seeing on the other side of the Atlantic.
Yeah, so I mean, I can see that being valuable for individual consumers, but also incredibly valuable from an institutional perspective, right? If I'm running a school district and I'm deciding, you know, which laptop to put in the hands of my students, right? That's a piece of information that ought to be, not that it always will be, ought to be like pretty persuasive in my decision-making process. So Lachlan, Paul's talking about kind of the end of this cycle. Do you have thoughts on what we can do to design products from a perspective that takes these questions about security, about sustainability, into account from, you know, from the beginning of this cycle?
Yeah, sure. Yes, I mean, I think when Paul was talking, I was kind of thinking as well about the design response in terms of end of life, and, you know, to what extent things like these new bits of legislation that say up front, yes, we will support this tech for up to 10 years of updates, but at the end of that 10 years, there's still going to have to be a process in place that needs to be designed in from a user experience perspective as to how do we deal with the fact that, you know, there will come to a natural end eventually.
That's right.
Okay. And I think drawing upon some of those kind of questions as to how would you implement that in terms of design, you know, what would you put in place? Like I mentioned, there's a range of different legal rights that people would have in relation to, you know, a lot of IoT devices, some data's at the edge, other data's in the cloud. How would you kind of design a process to say, okay, I want to request, or do subject access requests at end of life to get, okay, what data is held in the cloud, what's held locally, how can I kind of get access to that, how can I then decide what to do in terms of erasing it, importing it, all the rest of it. So trying to make that not just a legal, you know, it's a legal right for sure, and there's different channels you could maybe go through to do that, but if you were to try and integrate that into that very early on, you know, that could be, is that part of designing for repairability to an extent? I don't know, I mean, it's, you could fold it into other sorts of legal requirements that exist. So I think that to me would be an interesting one, and I think also, I do wonder about, you know, yesterday with the panel about sort of repair cafes, and, you know, to what extent is there a need to fold in support around your legal rights in these repair cafes to actually flag to people, you know, you actually have this set of things you could do to challenge and push back against what is going on, and how could that be part of that literacy and education building and trying to support having that aspect of it as well with devices maybe can't be fixed, and say, okay, well, here's another process we could go through to try and, you have a lot of data on there, maybe you still want to get it off. And I think the problem is that whilst these obligations, the range of them, you know, these cards try to map out, exist, you know, you do see quite problematic practices in terms of how contract law is still used as a mechanism to just carve out responsibility that a lot of these manufacturers should be taking. You know, so there's been interesting case law in the UK and the EU about people who are operating IoT devices in their home, smart home devices, cameras, ring doorbells, all that kind of stuff, where when you actually dig into some of the contracts, they will carve out and say, you're the data controller when you're operating this stuff. You know, and there have been cases that, yeah, because you should have, or we do have this sort of exemption for household data processing in the GDPR, but it's often very narrowly interpreted. So you have these really weird situations where like people who are running these things in their homes are being fined as joint data controllers or somehow responsible. You know, I think that does have implications for you know, security, privacy, and all the rest of it, because there's not enough being done to support them. You know, they're not making decisions as to how what sensors are being used in these devices, or the things normally a data controller would have some say over. They're kind of the end user, but they're still in this weird situation sometimes where they're having these responsibilities. So I think from that perspective, thinking and anticipating what some of those things might look like from a design perspective, you know, it needs to be anticipated. It needs to be not just downstream once it's out of the world, but oh, we really can't fix this now. It's a problem. It's trying to sort of build that mentality that we have a lot of really good provisions in the law. They need to be taken beyond that. They need to kind of be worked through. And again, from a research perspective, that's really interesting to sort of see, well, what could we learn from HCI as a discipline? Say, how could we reframe this problem, not just as a legal? So yeah, I think there's a lot that can be done, but it's having those conversations is still important.
Yeah. So, Denver, I kind of hear you offering a couple of strategies here, right? One is we should be deploying more free and open source software so that we can respond to these problems as they arise. I also, you know, as a former litigator, love the strategy of suing big companies and holding them accountable. I love it. What I'm curious about, though, is like, what do you have thoughts on how we respond to the devices that are already out in the world that are running entirely proprietary code? Is there a way that we can, you know, mitigate the harms that might be coming from those sorts of devices, or is the answer to, like, well, we just shouldn't be doing that in the first place, and you're offering a better strategy?
Yeah, well, I guess part of the answer to that is there are no such devices out there, in the sense that virtually all IoT devices run Linux or other software that is under the GPL. And when you have, when a company is using software under the GPL, they're required to provide the complete source code, which includes, and this is a quote from the GPL, the scripts used to control compilation and installation, which is the information that you would need to change the software on the device itself. And so, yes, there may be proprietary parts on top of Linux, like a user interface or something like that. You know, when we get the source code for these Vizio TVs, I don't expect it will include the user interface that they have, which is fine, because lots of free and open source software developers have written user interfaces for televisions already. So we can just put that on top of the Linux that Vizio gives to us, and we can run that on the television. So I would be happy to know about situations where there are very complex devices that do not use any software that is under the GPL or other copyleft licenses. But I think we do have a really good opportunity here through litigation and other means to get these rights back for us, because these companies are using this software because it is so valuable, precisely because it has been shared with other people and they're building on it and they're collaborating together, and that makes it super valuable. It's been estimated that Linux would cost $10 billion to re-implement. And so this is not the sort of thing that you just go and implement yourself. And so I think this gives us a lot of value and a lot of opportunity. So yeah, that's really what I would say. I would say that we do need to do more of these, you know, when necessary, more lawsuits. Like Software Freedom Conservancy doesn't do lawsuits as our first step. You'll see in the history of the Vizio case, it was 3 years from the time where we notified them of the violation until we sued them. We try to get these things resolved without lawsuits, but sometimes it's necessary. And part of why we're doing the lawsuit against Vizio is because we believe that people themselves should have the right to sue companies when the companies don't give them the source code that the license says they should get. And so we sued Vizio as a third-party beneficiary of the agreement between Vizio and the software developers of what Vizio needs to provide. And so, I think a win in Vizio will really show other people that, yes, you can sue these companies yourself. You don't have to wait for a software developer to want to do that on your behalf. And I think that's really going to change the game a lot in making companies feel that they actually have to do something. They can't just scare all of the software developers into not suing them because all of the millions of customers that they have could sue them to get the source code as well. And I think that's really important because people need to have their rights.
Wonderful. Before I open it up to the audience, do any of the panelists have questions for one another? Not to put you on the spot.
Yeah, I mean, I just for Denver, I'd be interested, what you think, assuming, knock on wood, you win this case against Vizio, what would follow from that in terms of, because, Vizio is just one vendor, all these vendors are using open source code, their stuff. What do you think the immediate aftermath, the effects of that?
Yeah, I think one of the things specifically for Vizio is that we would have essentially an OpenWRT for TVs. That is actually how OpenWRT started. Is there was a lawsuit in the early 2000s, and the first commit into the OpenWRT repository was actually that source code that resulted from the conclusion of that lawsuit. And so I think that is what would happen for Vizio, is that we would have this OpenWRT for TVs project, and that would allow people to use their TVs in this way. And I hope we have a lot more OpenWRT style projects for different classes of devices. And I think, to how it will affect the industry generally, I do hope that a win in Vizio will show companies that they should comply before they get sued. I think many of them won't, but I think we do really want to make sure that that pressure is there. So I would, encourage other people to collaborate or coordinate with nonprofits. We do often have volunteers that would like to do a lawsuit maybe in their home country. So we actually supported a lawsuit in Germany against the primary router manufacturer, AVM, in Germany. And so we were able to get source code from AVM in that. And so there are a lot of ways that we can collaborate to make this happen after that. And I do think that we will have a lot more opportunity, but I'm also very cognizant that it will likely need more lawsuits, and we're both prepared to do those and to assist with those as well until companies understand what is required.
And it will be called OpenWRTV.
Yeah, I think you've got it. You're definitely on the naming committee. Yeah.
I have a couple of questions.
Yeah, please.
So Paul, I was curious about. Oh, sorry. I was thinking about. You said at the start that a lot of the narratives around, right to repair and the risk of, from a cybersecurity perspective, is often so we can't possibly do this because there are all these concerns we'd have. And I was curious how much, with things like breaking digital laws, it often comes to copyright laws in that space. But how much has there been discussion around sort of computer misuse type legislation and unauthorized access as kind of one of the pushbacks for, we couldn't do this because we might then be at risk of being, criminal offences under hacking and the likes, that it's a slightly different thing to under copyright. Has that been a big discussion here with that sort of cybersecurity lens?
Yeah, so I mean, so section 1201 of the DMCA, which is around breaking software locks. Kyle obviously spoke about it yesterday. So that does figure pretty prominently in the cybersecurity community as a concern that researchers have, or when they're looking into software, trying to discover vulnerabilities, reverse engineering software is violating 1201. I don't think. I mean, it's not like vendors don't invoke 1201 and DRM as a way to try and knock down, recap right to repair legislation, but repair pretty generally, so the right to repair laws that have passed have really said, we have the right to disable locks for the purpose of repair and maintenance. And only insofar as we need to get access to the information necessary to do repairs. And do they still try and say service manuals are intellectual property and we should not share them? And this is all proprietary code, and they'll tell legislators, they're demanding access to our source code, and that's good, and which is of course not the case. So, do they? Yes, it's definitely used to muddy the water and try and dissuade legislators. Is there much substance to those arguments? No.
I would just add to that, this is kind of outside of my area of expertise, so I can't say anything particularly profound, but we've also got, at least in the US context, the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, which does, introduce those kinds of potential criminal penalties. That's always kind of looming in the background, or as a lawyer giving people advice, you've got to say, hey, also this thing exists, and yeah, they could put you in jail. But it is not being enforced maximally, and there have been, at least some, marginal some marginal narrowing through court decisions, but it's a kind of ambiguous looming threat out there.
Not one of those laws written very early in the computer age. It just is really not.
Yeah, not aged well.
Not aged well.
So in the UK, the Computer Misuse Act from 1990.
Yeah.
They're going to reform it. They've sort of had a consultation a couple of years ago, but it's
Still there.
Yeah, exactly.
So let's hear from the audience. Anybody got a question they'd like to ask? Yeah, please.
How do you guys think that, because we were talking about devices themselves and where they point back to and what happens when people sunset services, how do you feel that the Stop Killing Games, I know that they've got some traction in the EU lately, on, okay, great, like turning this over to a community-led thing when you shut down the service, how do you feel that that's going to affect like the physical device side as well, like the changing the tethers and things? Anybody?
Sure. I think that's a really important project, and it also really kind of teases out a lot of these issues that we're seeing because it's not necessarily easy to get some random third-party game running on a lot of these consoles or other devices because they just don't run third-party code or code that you write yourself, basically. And so I think there are a lot of reasons that we would need to be able to both maintain the servers, like being able to change the tether that the game has to the server that it will operate with. And yeah, I think these are very good initiatives to be able to be collaborating and coordinating with because they have exactly the same sorts of concerns that we have in a lot of these things, and that require the same sorts of solutions where we're able to control the tethers, change them to something else like the server run by a hobbyist or a gamer community or otherwise to keep these games going. And I think for archival purposes, it's very important to have these sorts of things available to us going forward. I think of games of the early 20th century, whether they be board games or otherwise, like these are relatively easy to archive, but these computer games, a lot of them just disappear because we're not able to run them on hardware that we have anymore, or because there's some sort of DRM that's very difficult to circumvent to maintain their operation on other hardware. So yeah, I think we really do want to collaborate and coordinate with them, and I think that's good, excellent that we have these sorts of projects going.
Yeah, I'd say the other thing is, one of the things that these types of laws will do is to spur markets, right? Create marketplaces for new types of services, companies, independent providers who might come along and say, well, I'll set up my own servers to host this game and provide, a better service than you might trying to do it on your own. It's just like with independent repair versus, dealership repair, right? Many more small independent car repair providers who provide choices, keep costs low, and so on. Now, just imagine that same dynamic across the software industry, where right now it is highly, centralized, concentrated, monopolized. So I think that would be a long-term effect, is you would just see more diversity, more choice, more variety, more healthier marketplace.
Thank you. I was just going to add, I think Denver see more to this than me, but I was curious about the fact that, a lot of these IoT devices, there's an ecosystem here. It's not just the firmware on the device, there's the mobile app, there may be any sort of third-party licensing for sensors, for AI on top of it, whatever it may be in terms of edge processing software, all that kind of stuff. And I think, I'm not sure how much, if some of that is running GPL licenses, and these companies decide to remotely brick it and switch it off, how much is there a challenge that you could make there that, by removing the ability to, because it's bundled, it's not just one piece, is there a way to kind of push back on that a little bit and say, well, a large part of how this thing functions is on open source software licensed under the GPL, and by making that decision to remotely brick it, has there been any sort of work in that space that you've seen of people trying to challenge those practices on the basis of breach of GPL, or I don't know, because I think for their more proprietary stuff, they could maybe have more prerogative to do that, but if it's also implicating GPLs and software,
Yeah, absolutely. I think for devices like gaming devices, for example, like there are some that intentionally give you the opportunity to run different OSs on them. Like the Steam Deck is a good example of that, where you can get into kind of a standard desktop mode and use it like you would any desktop computer. So that was built in there intentionally. But yes, a lot of other devices don't have that built in. And I would say with a lot of these gaming platforms, like the App Store or other things, those are generally fully proprietary, and there's not a lot of hook that we have to open up the code for those app stores. But certainly the devices underneath of them that the app stores run on them, we're generally able to get the source code for that through legal mechanisms or otherwise. But yeah, it is certainly a risk having these proprietary app stores, because it's not as easy to open those.
Great, other questions? Yes.
How far do you take this argument of breaking digital locks? Like, do you take it all the way to computers, like PLCs, and SCADA systems that control critical infrastructure?
For the purposes of repair, maintenance, and upkeep, yeah, of course, because again, the concept, the premise of saying, the digital, the Section 1201 was designed to prevent the piracy of music, movies, right, and video games, right. That is the concept, is not allowing digital piracy of that clearly copyrighted material to protect artists and their works. It was not designed to give manufacturers monopoly over service and repair. It just, there was not fair use exemptions, there was not language, and the lawmakers, Rep. ISA, when we testified, talked about this. They knew at the time that might really, be a problem over the long term, not in the mid to late 90s when this was being debated, but by the 2020s when software was running on everything, that this could be a big problem. But the lobbyists won and consumers lost, and they didn't put that fair use language into it. So yes, because what you want for critical infrastructure, programmable logic controllers, right, is you want resilience and serviceability. You want an organization, critical infrastructure facility that uses a PLC. If there's an issue with that, then it needs to be serviced and repaired. They need easy, quick access to a repair professional who can service it and get it working as soon as possible. That is not going to happen in a constricted, monopolized marketplace. And we see that in the military right to repair right now. So yes.
I'll just add on to that to do a bit of maybe Canadian translation here. I would say the equivalent, and perhaps others can correct me on this, but the equivalent of Section 1201 in Canada has gone through a few steps. I think it was C61, C60, and then I think eventually C21 was the actual bill that was passed, and the laws are very similar in a lot of ways. In fact, it looks like pieces of them may have been copied, in fact. But anyway, so yeah, I think we have definitely the same concerns in Canada about all of these issues, and I would definitely echo what was said about what this should mean for our devices, and also, you know, why it was implemented. You know, it's because a bunch of media monopolies want to maintain their media monopoly, and you know, other monopolies have adapted it to their own uses since then, and we should certainly resist that.
I would ask actually, because I know Canada actually, unlike the US, has updated their legislation to create fair use exemptions for that. Do we have a sense of whether that's had any impact?
I mean, it's interesting that in Canada there isn't like this regular exemption process that the US has every 3 years, but that also means that there's more impetus to make permanent exemptions. So that would be the example of like C244 and I think 294. So yeah, we have had some of those updates. They've been a bit later than I might have liked, but we still certainly got them in. But yeah, in terms of fair dealing in Canada, we do still have these concerns, as was highlighted earlier, about still not being able to distribute the circumvention tools, and so I think that's a big thing that we still need to work on in both countries.
I'm fighting the urge to launch into my 15-minute critique of the triennial rulemaking process. I'm not going to do it. Please go ahead.
I think following on from the last question, actually, so software, like supporting software of devices, including programmable logic controllers outside of the manufacturer's lifespans, is obviously important for repair. But then lots of these manufacturers come into these regulatory days saying, well, in order to secure these devices, we need to control the keys for how this software is loaded onto them. And they retain these keys only for themselves, and it's not available to the customer to control what's used on it. My question is, like, just to get it very clear, is it necessary to lock owners out of changing the software on their own purchased devices in order to make these products secure?
No, I mean, this is, yeah, I mean, it absolutely isn't, and obviously we see a wide and diverse ecosystem of open source devices, right, that are not measurably less secure than closed source and lockdown devices like that. No, it's an argument, again, this is a sort of security through obscurity, or, you know, put locks on the doors. It appeals to that part of our mind that says, oh, if there's you know, the OEM has a lock on the software, then that means that it's secure and so on. Obviously there are reasons for software locks, but is there a way to both, you know, deploy software locks to secure, you know, have signed software updates and stuff like that, but also have a diverse ecosystem of organizations, companies that can distribute software updates, that can manage updates and patches? Yes, of course. Yeah. So it is just a useful excuse for them to try and maintain, you know, monopolies on software updates. I mean, companies like Cisco Systems, you know, charges their customers for security updates, right? If you do not have active maintenance, an active maintenance agreement with them, which is very expensive, you do not get security patches for your devices. Who bears the cost of that? You know, for a small company that really can't afford Cisco's very costly maintenance, well, you know, that company does, we all do, the customers of that company do. So yeah, I mean, those are just realities of our current software marketplace that need to change.
And yeah, I think, you know, if a user wants to continue getting updates from the original manufacturer and leave the keys as they are, fine, you know, let them do that. But I think The issue here is trust, and if that trust changes later, you should be able to change where you get your updates. So you should be able to change those keys to go to the place that you trust to get the security updates from later, because the manufacturers aren't necessarily going to support the device in the same way or for the same length of time that you want, and I think that's the important part and the reason that you know, it's okay if you want to leave them as it is, but we must have the right to change it if we want to as well.
I mean, one of the points I made in my congressional testimony was sort of, you know, the audio industry is classic about, you know, or is you know, frequently makes this argument, this, you know, that presumes that, you know, we have built this secure walled garden for our cars that keeps malicious actors out, and of course, if we have to open this up to independent repair shops and owners, it's, you know, but you know, all you need to do is read your news feed to understand, like, that's not true at all. Like, car makers and mobile car apps and telematic systems are getting hacked constantly, you know, because the quality of, and I cited, you know, web hackers versus the auto industry, which was, you know, very famous exploitation of, I think, you know, 14 or 15 different automakers' systems. Their security is not very good. And the lack of transparency and competition for telematic systems creates incentives for them to not invest in security, but invest in the types of things that are going to, you know, make it easier for them to sell cars. So this lack of transparency, this lack of competition, actually has serious security repercussions.
Yeah, I mean, there's a risk of ending up in the sort of the, you know, the worst of both worlds, right? Where the malicious actors still have access to everything they want to have access to, and people who want to engage in like responsible behavior, whether it's repair or ensuring security of these systems, are, you know, legally prohibited from doing that. Yeah, Alyssa.
Thank you so much for these talks. It was really fascinating, and also thank you for your work in this area. The question I have, I guess I'll pose it to all of you, but maybe Paul, maybe you especially. I continue to be astounded by how much deference lawmakers or policymakers give to companies who claim their safety or security concerns, without providing any sort of evidence or proof of that. And I'm just wondering if you have any, or any of you have any strategies for, you know, basically forcing disclosure, like, you know, forcing proof of these claims?
Yeah, I mean, this sort of speaks to the need for broader, in all likelihood, federal legislation to, you know, hold software producers to the same standards that we hold, you know, car makers and airplane makers and medical device makers for the integrity and safety of their products, right? You know, if you know you're it's like unsafe at any speed. You know, if you were getting in, you know, low speed fender benders and your gas tank was exploding, people would be like, well, what's going on with how you design that car? And yet we read almost every day about massive hacks of large vendors, you know, hundreds of millions of customers' data exposed, you know, ransomware attacks that are taking down hospitals and critical infrastructure. And yet the conversation, and what was the cause of that? Well, they discovered, you know, exploitable vulnerabilities or zero-day vulnerabilities in software from, you know, Avanti, Cisco, F5, you know, all these huge multi-billion-dollar corporations. And yet the conversation never turns to, well, you know, why was that software distributed to customers with remotely exploitable, you know, level 9 or 10 vulnerabilities that were identified 6 or 7 years ago, but were still in the firmware? Like, how did that happen? But there is no conversation around that because there are no standards, there are no regulations, there is no part of the federal government empowered to oversee or manage that. And so it would be like if, you know, every week you were reading about buildings collapsing in New York or Boston, but nobody was ever like, why are these buildings all falling down? what's going, do we need to do some stuff around building design and you know, architectural engineering to make these things more secure? And I mean, that's kind of the software issue, which is there is no transparency, there is no disclosure, there is no accountability. And so for vendors, you know, focus on what's going to sell products, and it's not security.
Sorry. No, it was just to say, I mean, it's, so the colleague, we did an interview study a few years back, kind of looking to understand why is the state of IoT security so bad. So we spoke to a lot of different stakeholders, some from companies, some from government, some from a range of different places. And I think very much that point came through that security was an afterthought. It wasn't something that was planned into the development, particularly with sort of the SMEs and startups who were just trying to get products to market. It was like, oh, we'll fix this down the line, version 2.0 never gets fixed. You know, within the larger organizations, there was kind of that misalignment of priorities where, again, it was we just want to get this to market. We don't really have time to kind of do this well, which I found quite interesting given a lot of the problems with IoT security. Felt like surely there are lessons from software development more generally that we've learned that could have been drawn upon much more concretely with these things. But yeah, so it was certainly at that point as well, there was, you know, a lot of concern from what standards do we adhere to. You know, there wasn't necessarily, in the UK we've got the Product Security and Telecoms Infrastructure Act now, which kind of tries to do a lot of the same as to what the EU Cyber Resilience Act does. But at that point there was a little bit more, well, what standards do we adhere to? There wasn't necessarily those harmonised things in place. So it kind of helped get a better sense of why it's quite bad, but I don't think it would necessarily answer that question as to how do you force them to justify more concretely that narrative that.
Yeah, I think both Paul and Lachlan mentioned this, is that it's about incentives. Like the companies are not incentivized to make security updates. They would rather focus on new features or, you know, lock-in mechanisms or whatever else it is to identify it. And so I think that's an important reason to have two things. One is the legislation to make sure that they will keep updating these, but also the escape hatch, if you will, to say that people can take it into their own hands to do the updates themselves if the companies are not complying with the law, because it may take a while. As you know, we know it can take many years to get through a lawsuit and that sort of thing. And so people need that escape hatch as well to be able to take things into their own hands and do their own security updates. And to speak to your point about how you know we respond to people who are saying, oh, it's all about security and this sort of thing. You know, we've had that in the Vizio lawsuit where Vizio has said, well, we couldn't possibly let you install what you want on it because we have all these DRM keys on the TV. And we're like, fine, delete them all. We don't want any of your DRM keys. We just want to install the software that you've been modifying that is released under these licenses onto the TV with the changes of our choice. You know, we can run, you know, watch these videos in a browser or whatever it is. We don't need your DRM keys to do that. And so, you know, this is one of the questions they posed. We had our response to the question and radio silence since then. So
We
I
delete
think
the DRM keys, we can't control it.
right, exactly. So I think this can be very effective, and I think, you know, legislators and judges will look favorably on these sorts of back and forths.
So I would just add to that, in the legislative context, the strategy is show up. The arguments from these companies are incredibly shallow. They show up with 4 bullet points, and if you get beyond those, their answer to every question is China. I mean, we saw this a couple weeks ago in Colorado, right, where there was an effort to unwind some of the right to repair legislation as applied to what they claimed was critical infrastructure, but was basically everything with a chip in it. And Paul and some other people showed up and just thoroughly dismantled these arguments in about 15 minutes. And they kind of walked away with their tails between their legs. And, you know, I'm sure they'll be back. But if people didn't show up, there's no one to counter those arguments. So I think that's step 1, 2, and 3. I think that's it. We're out of time. So thanks, everybody.
much, everyone. So we'll just take a 30-minute break for coffee. We'll be back here with more.